Unit 3, the structure of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah has a really clear structure that if we know about it, it will really help us understand the book as we go to read it. Because Isaiah is a long book. It's got 66 chapters. But if you know that it has two main parts, it helps you kind of separate and be able to navigate the book a little bit. So what I want to do is I want to look at these two parts of the book of Isaiah and how it's broken up. So part 1 is chapters 1 through 39. And part 2 is chapters 40 through 66, So you've got these two clear parts. Now, even with these, we're going to break these down a little bit in a second. But before we get to that, part 1 is really about kind of everything from before Assyria, right near the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, all the way kind of up to right about before when Babylon is almost going to be a power on the scene. So you got from Assyria, before Assyria, up to Babylon in part 1. And in part 2, is really looking forward to the future. So part 2 is very prophetic. It looks forward from the end of Babylon to the end of the captivity, even to beyond that, to the future. So let's look real quick at our two parts. We got part 1, chapters 1 through 39, and then part 2, 40 through 66. So let's look at part 1 first. So part 1 has its own substructure that's helpful to know. And so if we look at these kind of chapter blocks, this is kind of how part 1 is broken out. So if in the first 5 chapters, really the focus is the failure of Judah, but it's mixed with a lot of the future hope that God still has for them. So they have participated in a lot of the idol worship, predominantly brought upon by kings like Ahaz. But Isaiah emphasizes that there is still hope for Judah because of God's covenant faithfulness. In chapter 6, though, it's like its own section because Isaiah 6 is a phenomenal chapter because it focuses on and it gives us what we call Isaiah's call and vision of God. And if you remember Isaiah 6, it starts when it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up." And it gets this amazing vision of God in chapter 6. And chapter 6 is kind of the frame, kind of what sets the tone for everything that follows. So the rest of part 1 is kind of like bookended by these two blocks of chapters. So you've got chapters 7 through 9, which takes place during Ahaz's reign. And then at the end of the block, you have chapters 36 through 39, which takes place during Hezekiah's reign. Now, what's interesting about these two is these are kind of mirror images of one another because it mentions some similar geography, a lot of similar stuff happens, but there are two different enemies during these times. So during chapters 7 through 9, we know that the main issue here is the fact that we have the northern Israel king Pekah combined with the Syrian king. They're attacking Ahaz. So that's what's going on in chapter 7 through 9. But in chapters 36 through 39, during Hezekiah, it's like the same kind of thing, but now the enemy is Assyria. So if we look back at our timeline real quick, you can see that chapter 7 through 9 kind of takes place right around there during the early parts of Isaiah's ministry. And then the second one, 36 through 39, the other bookend, is the Assyrian threat. So a lot of Isaiah takes place kind of bookended by these two threats that he lives to see and that the kings have to face. So Isaiah had a long ministry, though. I mean, he had a 53-year ministry. And that's a long time. He was a faithful voice of Yahweh to these kings during this time. And so we got this structure. So you got chapters 1 through 5, you got 6, and then you got these two blocks. Well, what happens in between there? Well, from 8 through 35, really, this is just a large section of oracles of judgment to other nations, and combined with that, where you have glimpses of hope. So you see that a lot of it is the judgment that is coming upon them for their wickedness and idolatry, but still always mixed in with glimpses of hope. In fact, if you look at even the very end of part 1, we see that it says, "Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, 'Hear the word of the Lord of hosts.'" He says this, "Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day," now the house, of course, meaning the temple, "everything that you've accumulated shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord." So he gives this prophecy to Isaiah even before Assyria is the real threat. He says, hey, here's what's going to happen to the temple in the future. Get ready. And he speaks this to Isaiah, who shares it with Hezekiah. And then Hezekiah says, "Well, the word of the Lord, which you have spoken, is good, for at least there will be peace and truth in my days," which is an interesting kind of response. But that's how part 1 ends. And then the very first verse of part 2 starts with the word comfort. It says, comfort, yes, comfort my people. And that's why part 2, the theme of Isaiah, of the second half of the book, is very different than kind of a lot of what happens in the first, because part 2 now looks forward to the future. So now we're looking from kind of Babylon even into the kind of the future glory of what they call Zion, which is God's holy city that he's going to restore in the future. So you've got these 4 blocks of how part 2 is broken up. So you got 40 through 48, 49 through 55. You can see right there, 56 through 59, and then the last one, 60 through 66. So there's a lot of content in Isaiah. So 40 through 48 looks toward the end of the captivity. So again, remember, we haven't even really hit Assyria yet, but he looks way to the end of the Babylonian captivity, prophetically speaking toward that time. And then you have this amazing section here, 49 through 55, and here's where it describes in beautiful detail the future restoration. See, right now they're dealing with all kinds of struggle and strife, but Isaiah, God speaks to Isaiah to tell them that there is a future restoration coming, and specifically that there is a Messiah or a servant, which we learn about during this section, specifically Isaiah chapter 53, which when we look at the ministry of Jesus, is a phenomenal mirror of what will come into the ministry of Jesus. But this is hundreds of years earlier. So that is the section there, really focusing on the future restoration, but also specifically looking at the Messiah. But then you have another section on Israel's continuing failure to be faithful to Yahweh. And then the last section is really looking forward to the future glory of God's people, how he will redeem and restore Israel. So there's a lot to the book of Isaiah. But just knowing that there are these 2 parts kind of gives at least a little bit of a framework. So when you're reading it, you can understand where you are in which part. But what do we know about Isaiah the person? So there's some things that we want to make sure that we know as we approach this book. There's so much to cover. We could do a whole course just on Isaiah, and we will. But just for here, just a couple key things to keep in mind. For one, Isaiah is quoted more than any other New Testament book except the Psalms. So Isaiah is constantly referenced in the New Testament, which is awesome. But one of the key themes is this concept of the Holy One of Israel. This phrase about God, spoken from Isaiah, occurs 30 times in just this book, and it occurs only 6 times everywhere else in the Old Testament. So it's a huge emphasis of God's infinite holiness and his otherness, his difference from both the false idols of the time of Judah, but also of our view of God. And he is so wholly other, and Isaiah reminds us of that. He also himself came from a royal lineage, which gave him this access to the kings that we see, which is why he had such an influence. And what's amazing is that his warnings against alliances with other nations was a huge part of the history of Judah, because Isaiah said, "Do not align yourself with other nations." In fact, if you think about it, Assyria was the superpower during the time of Isaiah. We know what happened in the north. They take over. But why don't they take over Judah? Well, one of the reasons was because God had protected Judah because of Isaiah's call to trust in Yahweh and not trust in other nations. And so that was a huge component of why Assyria was never able to overtake Judah when they had overtaken the north, because we knew that the north was not trusting in Yahweh, and God, of course, gave them up. But that did not happen in Judah, predominantly because of Isaiah and his call to trust God. So there's some glimpses or some important things to know about Isaiah. Just to review real quick, these are the 4 themes, which we kind of can see now, that we introduced in the last module: the holiness of God, the judgment of Judah, the redemption of the coming Messiah, and God's future plans. So this is a lot of what we find in Isaiah. And I just want to give you a quick glimpse of these future plans as we look in Isaiah 55. So this is the section of the restoration and the Messiah. But he says, "Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the water. And you who have no money, come and buy and eat." So he's describing this restored land that God is now offering and inviting the people back into. So you can hear the heart of God here. He says, "Yes, come and buy wine and milk without money, without price. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and for wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and let your soul delight itself in abundance." But then it says this: "Incline your ear and come to me. Hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make" what? "An everlasting covenant with you, the sure mercies of David." So here he mentions the Davidic covenant, but he also mentions this future covenant that we're going to start to now see. But the thing is that despite the necessary discipline of Judah, the prophet Isaiah is important because he reminds Judah of God's great love for them. See, despite their wickedness and idolatry, what does Isaiah do? What does God do through Isaiah? He gives them a glimpse of a future covenant that is everlasting. And so now what we're going to do is we get this glimpse from Isaiah, but we're really going to start to see it developed as we look at our next prophet, and that is Jeremiah. So in our next unit, in Unit 4, let's take a look at the context of Jeremiah because it's very different than Isaiah. And so we want to make sure that we understand as we look at the prophet Jeremiah, we understand that his times, because there is a lot to cover. So join me, if you would, in the next unit, Unit 4, the context of Jeremiah the prophet.